Welcome to another edition of Up Close and Personal, a series where I interview members of the Friends of Crimea. And tonight I will profile one of our newest members. He's an American born writer, author. He's living in Denmark. Tonight, welcome Ron Ridenour. Ron, let's begin with a little background. Where were you born? Where were you raised? Where you grew up? If you had family, and a little bit about your parents.
I was born in a little town in Ohio in 1939. My father is of Anglo-Saxon, I said German background. Some time ago, and my mother English. So I'm considered a WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And he went to war. I have a younger brother who's dead now. He died in an accident. He was 2 years younger. And when I was 3, I think, my father went to war. And my mother was left alone, and she couldn't handle us two. So I went with her mother for a while. And then when the war was over, they got divorced, and I stayed with my grandmother until I was 8, when he came to get me to live with him until I was 17, and he had another woman. I think the most significant thing that I want to say in the beginning here is that I consider myself first and foremost an activist, an anti-war activist, and a civil rights activist, or for equality for everybody. And I think that the most significant event in my life that at least started this thought process and is what happened when I was about 6 years old. I was in this little apartment building in Newark, New Jersey, close to a black ghetto. And I was playing Roy Rogers and on his horse Trigger. Folk who are a lot younger than me will not remember Roy Rogers, but he was a major, cowboy star in the movies, and the TV had just begun. And I was, of course, the good guys shooting the bad guys. The bad guys were the Indians, of course. I was brought up in a WASP family, in a military state, the United States of America. And all of a sudden I heard, that sounded like shots. I mean, I had my pistol up and going bang, bang. And I heard something, and I went to the window and I looked across the street. Across the street, there was a black kid about my size. He's maybe 7 or 8. And he had blood coming out of his back. And a policeman came up to him, a white policeman, of course, in his blue uniform, and he had his pistol in his hand. And I was shocked, I was appalled and confused. And my grandmother was, I can't remember exactly where, but later that day, her husband, who was sort of my grandfather, came home and said, well, they heard on the radio that the kid had stolen an apple from a kiosk. He was walking on the sidewalk and there was some fruit outside there, and he took an apple and he walked away. And this policeman saw him, and he said he yelled at him to stop, and the kid didn't. He ran. Now, somehow or another, it's totally all right to shoot at somebody when they steal an apple. So the cop took his pistol out, and he said he shot up in the air. Now, apparently in Newark, New Jersey, there was a lot of smog or something up in the air that the bullet supposedly hit, and ricocheted down into the back of this boy. And I think that that event, you know, stayed in me until today. And I was worried about myself. And my grandmother said, "Well, you don't have anything to worry about. First, you're not a thief; you wouldn't steal an apple. And importantly, you're not black." I don't remember what word she used for black, but I don't remember that my grandmother or my father were really racist. They were just, ordinary white Americans. And and the fact that I wasn't black or Negro, stayed with me. When I was, and I'll later tell you about, you know, my activism in Cuba, but I think it's relevant to say it just now. In 1991 or two, I was at King's College in Cambridge giving a speech about Cuba, and I just written a book and about Cuba, and this is the book, uh, Backfire: The CIA's Biggest Burn. And in this book, it's explained how the 26 Cubans infiltrated the CIA, who they thought they bought them to spy on the CIA, spy on Cuba for them. At any rate, I was at King's College, with this book and on this tour, and somebody in the audience asked me, what was it that started me as a revolutionary? And that's when I thought, I hadn't thought about this kid for a long time, and he came back to me, and that's the start of my life.
So, tell me about your education. After high school, did you go to college? Did you go to university?
Well, first, when my father took me to live with him, that was in Oklahoma, and we were there for 4 or 5 years, and he was a sergeant, a warrant officer. He was a career man. He was first in the Air Corps, and then the Air Force. So he was sent to Brazil, and I was 12 or 13 when we went there, and I was there for 3 years. So I learned Portuguese, and I learned about U.S. imperialism without understanding it. Those years, for instance, we had 3 maids and one who lived there permanently, and all black, of course, and beggars came to our house every day and took things from the garbage cans, and many Brazilian kids wouldn't play with me because I was a Yankee, and I really didn't understand why. And then one day, my father came home livid, and he said, "That son of a bitch president, Vargas, it was his name. He was a typical nationalist Latin American president who was not at all, radical, but he wanted to have some sovereignty. He thought that he should have some say in his own country, and he apparently didn't have any say or as much as he wanted. So he committed suicide, and he wrote a note blaming the United States for intruding in his country. That was in 1954, and my father was cussing him out for all the good that the United States had done. And this, made me all the more concerned. What the hell is going on? We came back to the United States when I was 15, and I went to high school. And when I was just turned 17, in high school, I played tennis and chess. I'd learned in a military base. I mean, we lived off of the base, but in a military base, there was a tennis court, and I learned to play tennis. And well, that was kind of like a sissy, because to be a real man or a little boy, you should play, baseball or football and beat up everybody on the field, and chess was outrageous. So I was kind of, not accepted in the normal sense of, of teenage life, and knowing another language was something you shouldn't do either. Well, at any rate, the Soviet Union had a quarrel with one of its countries, Hungary. I learned later the CIA was working on one of its color revolutions. But regardless of the CIA's activities in Hungary, many people were not satisfied with Soviet life, and there was an uprising. And then the Soviet Union came in and put it down. So, of course, I was against communism without knowing really what it was. Uh, but my father encouraged me to join the service, and I did. He had to sign his name because I was under 18. So I left the senior year in high school, and I was sent to Kessler Air Force Base in Mississippi. Um, this was what, 1956. And again, I was learning to radar, and they were going to send me somewhere, one of their colonies or something. And I was playing tennis, singles and doubles, and my partner was black. And when we got our first pass from the base, we went into town. And we were about to go into a cafe or something, and people rushed at us and, called us all kinds of names because I couldn't be white with a black guy. And we were chased back to the base. We got to the base, and the next day, the commander of the base calls us in and chews us out for violating the rights of Mississippi. And in another occasion, something like that, I'm very patriotic, but I don't understand why it's, bad to have a black tennis partner or friend. And I got court-martialed for doing something like this with this guy. At any rate, I was sent to Japan, and a little radar station in a mountain, and there was the local bars were 14 kilometers away, and the barracks were segregated. I was in a barracks with everybody other than, I think, one other person were from the South. They walked around the base in full uniform with a baseball cap, not uniform, on their heads with KKK. And this was, totally accepted. Blacks slept in some barracks, and we slept whites in another. We went to town, and the blacks had a so-called black bar, Japanese, with Japanese prostitutes, and the whites had their prostitutes. So they divided, colored people who were Japanese, those that could have sex or just drink with whites, and those that could only with blacks. Well, I didn't like that. I don't know. This is the most important thing that ever happened to me in my life, is I just never accepted racism. So I went to the black bar, and I got back to the barracks, and the word got back, and they took me, these white guys, made me naked, put me on top of the bunk bed, it was steel, held me down with my hands and my feet, and they sprayed DDT on my testicles and lit it. It was in snow, it was winter, and they burnt all of my, instead of it, I still have my penis functioning more or less at this, but, I was very painful. And then they put me under the under the snow. And this was, accepted by the officers. So I learned a lot in that year in Japan. We always had, every Friday, we had briefings where they told us how evil the Russians were. It was almost like they ate children. And of course we were ready to shoot them down if they came over our territory, which was all of Japan, and it still is all of Japan. So I was curious, as why would we shoot them down when I was involved every day that I worked? in sending up reconnaissance spy planes over Japan. And they never shot them down. A few years later, they did shoot down one U-2. Powers was the pilot, and it made a big international, issue. Eisenhower was president, and they captured him, and he was supposed to have killed himself with a cyanide pill, and he didn't. And he came back and said he wasn't poorly treated. So when I got out of when I got out of Japan, I went back to the States, and I was in Oklahoma at an Air Force base where my father was. And when I got out of the service, I burned my uniform. It was 1960. And I started college in California. And I was one of the first to demonstrate. It was like, the youth movement was just beginning. And it started in North California, Berkeley. And it was, students wanting more power, more say, and protesting. Well, the war in Vietnam had started, but it was just very beginning, And so my first demonstration was when they did the Bay of Pigs invasion. And I didn't know it. I didn't know anything about communism, but the headlines of the paper the next day were this demonstration. And my picture was in the paper. And behind me was the leader of the Communist Party in California. And it turns out that the communists and Trotskyists had combined to demonstrate, and they had an organization called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And I don't know if you can really see it, but this is the card. I still have it. And it was signed by one of the leaders in 1960. And I carry it around with me as a momentum. So that gets me into activism.
So you were studying in university where?
UCLA, University of California at Los Angeles. And later on, I graduated with a bachelor from the California University, California State University, it's called. But it's very significant that in 1962, I decided to leave the college. And because I was very involved with Cuba at this point, that, Oswald. Well, Oswald supposedly started the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans, where he was, living. And although the building where he had an address was where they had all kinds of U.S., offices, government offices. In the same block, there was a CIA office, etc. Well, we learned later on, of course, that he was a patsy and, was not at all involved in Cuba. And the CIA had dressed up somebody that supposedly looked like Oswald and sent him to Mexico City. And he went to the Cuban embassy there to try to get a visa to come into Cuba. Unfortunately, they didn't let him come in. They thought something was suspicious. But when Kennedy was murdered, a section of the CIA, which was the section that was doing all the dirty work in Cuba, wanted to blame it on Fidel Castro. And Johnson had come into power and wanted to increase the war in Vietnam, but he didn't want a world war. And if you invaded Cuba, maybe Russia would do something about it. So he was not happy with the idea that Fidel Castro should have been behind the murder of Kennedy. But the leadership of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was in New York, were very worried because they were, the FBI and behind them, the CIA, were arresting people and the leadership and interrogating them. And the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was in the media as an arm of Fidel. So they closed down the committee. Well, I wanted to go to Cuba. I could speak Spanish and I often went to Mexico. It was close by, and Portuguese in my background. And a friend of mine from college, he and I drove his Volkswagen through. We wanted to get down to Costa Rica and then take a boat over. And on the way to Cuba, and on the way, we were in Nicaragua when the missile crisis started. So there were troops everywhere, and when we got to Cuba, or rather Costa Rica, there was a lot of police around, and we were trying to get to Cuba, and I made contacts with somebody, um, and there was a demonstration, and I was at the demonstration and got arrested. So they found my Fair Play for Cuba Committee card, and and they said no prisoner could speak with me, and and no guards could speak with me. And apparently one guard did, and he was chastised for it. And I was taken out, and I had a beard. I was very romantic at that time, and I was imitating Fidel. And they took me out in the center, and all where all the prisoners could see, and they shaved off my beard. Two men shaved off my beard with like razor blades, to demasculinize me. Well, we were deported back to the United States, and nothing happened to me after that on that issue. And then I was an activist constantly throughout my college years, and I got married in 1987, and 67, and I had to get work. I wanted to become a journalist, and yeah, I dropped out of school again. No, in 1964, there was a big campaign to get to get black people to the right to vote in Mississippi. So I joined that movement, and I was still a member. I had joined the Communist Party in '64 earlier, and my partner, we lived together. He and I were in the Communist Party, and we drove to Mississippi. And first, we were given instructions in Ohio, and this was a major voting campaign that the NAACP, the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was a part of the NAACP, and a couple of other groups, civil rights groups, conducted this campaign for voting rights in Mississippi. And we were housed by black families wherever we were in various parts of Mississippi. And I was an activist, but I was also in charge of doing publicity, both internally and externally. So I was often in office work, and other people were taking black people to get up to register to vote, and we were always being rejected. And one late afternoon, we were on the lawn where our black family had a house, and the police came by and arrested us and took us to the woods somewhere and met some civilians. And we were quite alarmed because the news had come out that three men, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, were missing. They were three civil rights workers who, one, Cheney, was black and the other two were white. And we had all been trained in a college in Ohio, and we were driving to our post in Mississippi, and they were taken someplace in Mississippi, and they were murdered, drastically murdered, and buried. And I was in another place, and we heard that they were missing the next day, And that night, this other man and I were arrested. I was, 24 then, I think. And and we were thrown in the black cell, which is, unusual because everything is segregated. And the white cops were, banging the bars and telling the blacks to beat us up. And we were telling them we were there civil rights workers and they didn't beat us up. So they threw us in the white cell and told them to beat us up. And the leader of the group that approached us spoke Spanish, I could tell. And so I spoke with him in Spanish and told him what it was all about, and that, why beat up people who are defending blacks' rights when, you also have rights problems. So they didn't beat us up. And the cops were really pissed off. I got a bump over the head, but nothing serious. And we had many lawyers, and they came, fortunately, to where we were the next day, and they got us out. So the rest of that, summer was very important to me, and it was one of the greatest activities that I've ever been engaged in, and the whole notion of black and white together, and all the songs that we sang, and all the energy we had. Uh, we were brothers and sisters, and on this bastard Lyndon Baines Johnson wanted to be popular apparently, and he signed 2 civil rights bills, which were very important. But the whole pressure was from us, and we were many people throughout the United States, black and whites, and we won those objectives, the Civil Rights Acts of '65, and so then I went back to college in California and continued to activate against the war in Vietnam and civil rights work, and was often arrested. And that was my main occupation aside from studying until I got married, which was a mistake. And so then I started to, become a journalist. I didn't have much training, but it wasn't necessary to get a degree then. So I worked my way into journalism from the streets, so to speak. My first job was with a Hanford Sentinel in 68, 69, right? And I was doing well there. I had a good job, but I made the mistake of finding out that there was a covenant against blacks and Mexican Americans from housing restrictions. So I wrote an article about it. First, I was a sports editor, and then I got kind of promoted to writing news. And I wrote an article about this racist covenant I got to see. But I was writing for the Hanford Sentinel. It's only one newspaper in middle of California. So all of the businessmen assumed that we were on the right side, and it was a chain, and the Republicans owned this chain. So I got to see the covenant, the racist covenant. I got to see where they had, this policy of not selling houses or even renting houses to Mexican Americans. And I wrote an article about it, and my editor let it happen. It was, on the front page. And the owner of the paper, or, like, this is a chain. So the ownership has a publisher, and he called me into the office and chewed me out lividly. How can you write such a thing? Is it, you have to learn what you can write and not write. And Ron, you're, a good journalist, and you're going to, we will have you in the chain and you can work your way up the ladder, but you have to learn what you can write and not write. Yeah, well, I saw that was doomsday for me. And at the time, I'd gotten married, and my wife was pregnant. And it turns out we were going to have twin boys. And, so I couldn't go on with this work. But my wife was out of work, and so I went back to the next day after I got chewed out, and he bought me dinner. And the next day it was found out that I was threatened with being fired. So Mexican Americans, whom I really didn't know, came to demonstrate to keep my job. And of course, it caused him to fire him, the leader to fire me. So we had to leave and go to another place. And I got another job in Riverside Press Enterprise, which was a larger paper, and I had more responsibilities. I was had my own pages. The Black Panthers had started, and I was, helping them on the QT with some media work, and one day, and I just gotten promoted and a higher salary, and the FBI came, and the next day I was fired, and the FBI had told the owner that I was a bad guy. I was a communist. By that time, I'd left the Communist Party. I was in for 4 years. What was it, 64 to 69? I left the party because of Czechoslovakia. I just thought that was too much to invade Czechoslovakia. It was a part of the the Soviet bloc, but I was opposed to the regime change that Moscow imposed. So again, I was out of work, and I went to Los Angeles, which I had been an activist there, and I started other kinds of work. I worked. We had an alternative media. I worked for the LA Free Press. I worked for 3 or 4 different medias, and was doing a lot of good writing and still activist against the wars. Vietnam was still going on. So I had 2 boys in 1970. Malcolm, Eugene. Named them after Malcolm X and Eugene Debs. Well, I worked for a lot of weeklies. One of them, Dave Lindorf, and I started the LA Vanguard. Dave Lindorf is a very successful alternative media man. He's had books out about the atomic bomb, and how the Soviet Union got the atomic bomb with the help from people who were in New Mexico at the time. So we started our own paper with some capital from somebody, and we got infiltrated by the local FBI, the Los Angeles Police Department. They have a political wing that works with the FBI. And of course, I got 1,000 pages from the FBI's, surveillance. They were after me all the time, followed me here and there, got me arrested sometimes. And my children I took them to demonstrations sometimes. The wife I had then was okay with that, but we've got divorced, and then she wanted to take the children from me, which she did. So I just got to see them sometimes, and I worked at this paper that was called the Los Angeles Vanguard. Our paper got infiltrated by a police agent, and we were trying to sell them and get subscriptions, and we were selling them on the streets in machines, and the local police sabotaged our machines, and we were trying to get them sold in other places, and they sabotaged that. So eventually the newspaper got broke. I became a stringer for the Washington Post. And this was okay, Watergate. Um, the Washington Post then was a little bit liberal, you know, and they did a good job on the Watergate, you know, and the local the West Coast correspondent wanted me to come in as a full time person, and I got to write a couple pieces for the Washington Post. But I saw that I would have to give up my activism, and I turned down the offer. Uh, I worked for the ACLU as the public relations director, uh, and then I went freelance. I did a lot of work on Nicaragua. I got an article, in fact, in the New York Times, Nicaragua in 81, 82. I was a leader of the Contador. The Contador process was um, uh, social democrats in Latin America, in Central America, wanted an end to the war. The United States in Reagan's 80s, they were taking over, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and trying to take over Costa Rica. So I went to Costa Rica and wrote about the war going on, and then I was a leader of this Contadora March. We had 50,000 people in Mexico City. We were 300 to 400 activists from many countries in Europe and the United States and some Latin American countries, and we had a march with buses from Panama to Mexico. And I was not allowed to come into Costa Rica because I had been there earlier and organized activities. And so the CIA was very active in this, opposing this marches. We had a lot of support and in much media of in Europe and some in the United States. But they used me as a former member of the Communist Party to be, like the key leader. I was one of several leaders. We had a collective leadership, but they wanted to smear the march. So one of the leaders wanted me out. So we had some internal problems there, which also reflect much activity throughout the years. If revolutionaries or real radicals are with liberals or less radical radicals, they always try to divide us and divide and conquer. So that occurred during our march, but I was not able to come into Costa Rica, but the majority of the march wanted me to continue. So I got in again from Nicaragua on up to Mexico, and we had 50,000 people in the march in Mexico, and the Mexican government, while it was under U.S. control largely, it still supported our march. It was an amazing sovereignty act, and it was one of the major events in my life.
I'm really interested in how you got to Cuba. I can see the trail. After this activism in Central America, what motivated you to go to Cuba, and how did you get there?
I saw myself primarily as an activist, but now I was writing a lot of articles, a lot of, and some freelance. And I was invited by the Nicaraguan government to come and do public relations for a cultural association. This was 80, 82, 83. And I was, I got married. I left the United States in 1980, and because I fell in love with a Danish woman that was visiting friends of mine, and we met in Los Angeles. And my children were 10 years old, and I was having a hell of a time with their mother, who was, trying to take them away from me, and she really hated me. And I met this other woman, a Danish woman, Greta, and so we wanted to get together, and so I left the United States in 1980, came to Denmark, and got jobs here and whatever I could get, and I was doing freelance. I was writing for In These Times, as a matter of fact. I think it still exists, and making a little money freelance. And then in 1982, uh, I went to Costa Rica. I went to Nicaragua uh, to work for the government, and as a PR man. And I was in a war zone. The United States had their counter-revolutionaries in Honduras, which was a, a lackey for the United States, and I was with a group of entertainers, yeah, including clowns, and so we were entertaining the Sandinista, Nicaragua Sandinista. The Sandinista was the organization of revolutionaries. So we were, entertaining the troops up close to the border of Honduras. And I was, some of us were given rifles to support, us if we were attacked. And in this one little town where we were entertaining, and I was a writer, not an entertainer, the village was attacked. So I was, encouraged to join in to defend the village. The president's wife got wind of this, and she didn't like this because I guess I was never told, but here I was, a citizen of the United States. I had a Nicaraguan Sandinista revolutionary rifle, which was probably made in the United States, or and I was willing to defend the revolution. So I got fired, and she told me some other reason. And well, this is what got me to write my first book. There were many good North Americans living and working in Nicaragua, and there still are, and were and many had different skills, and they were using their skills to support the revolution. So I decided that I would write about them. And this is my first book, Yankee Sandinistas, Interviews with North Americans Living and Working in the New Nicaragua, by Ron Ridenour. And this is, this book I gave to Fidel Castro, and he wrote his signature on the book. That was when I got to Cuba, which comes a little bit later. But this book was interview. I said Phil Agee, who was Phil Agee was the, I think, first CIA agent to come over to us, and of course he wrote a very important book, The CIA Diary. And I got to know him a little bit in Cuba, or rather actually in Denmark. He eventually went to Cuba, and he died in Cuba. Graham Greene has written about this book, and I've had many good reviews. Even in the United States, daily newspapers reviewed the book. Went to Cuba again for a longer period of time. They asked me to come and work full-time for a book publishing house, and as an author and an editor. And I was married to the Greta at the time. She could have come with me, but she liked her job, and so she stayed in Denmark. I was there 8 years, and we got to see each other a little bit, a month here, a month there. She came several times. I came to Denmark a couple of times. But I dedicated myself to Cuba and ended up writing 6 books about Cuba. And I'll show you my first one. This is called Backfire, the CIA's Biggest Burn. It was published by the Jose Marti Publishing House. I was and Noam Chomsky wrote about it. Phil Agee wrote about it. Noam Chomsky also wrote about my Nicaragua book. He was also a volunteer friend of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and Noam Chomsky and I met in Nicaragua, and therefore, he knew me and wrote, about that book. One of the best evidences I have about the CIA's evil doings, massacres. There's like friends of ex-CIA agents that come over to us, and they have an organization. And years ago, they published in this time, and this book came out in 1990. And at that time, they said, these ex-CIA and military agents said that they knew of 6 million people that CIA has killed. Now, that's not taken into account in the yearly report that is given by the Congress, the United States Congress, about U.S. wars and whatever they call their wars. Officially, they've only, I think, had 5 wars, but they admit to 350 military interventions like wars. Other people who've done studies, like William Bloom, have come, who's now dead, but he dedicated his writing life to writing about the CIA. And he comes up, I think, with 650 wars that the United States have conducted with other names. Well, the CIA is, doing chemical biological warfare. And the great thing about this book, or rather, the fact that the counterpart to the CIA, the Ministry of Interior counterintelligence people who I got to know, many of them, they infiltrate the CIA, of course, whenever they can, as the CIA does to them, etc. And they had their agents, with wiretaps, and so we have evidence. And in my book, there is this evidence, much of it, how the CIA was planting bacteriological warfare. They contaminated crops, they contaminated pigs. They had to destroy all of their pigs. Dengue fever. 101 people were killed, mostly children, from dengue fever that they infiltrated. And I have proof of that in this book. It's no longer in print. And it was printed in Cuba, of course, and it didn't get much distribution in the United States. But Cuba also sent it to many of their embassies, and it was given to journalists. And it's up until we get to Russia, it's been my most important work, and that I'm very proud of. And I know for facts, and they are in this book, that the CIA was doing what I just said. Well, I was there in Cuba until 96. And then I came back to Denmark. I burned my passport. I had a Yankee passport when the United States invaded Iraq the first time. So I went to the Office of Interest. The United States didn't have an embassy there in Havana, and I burnt my passport. And CNN then was a little bit liberal. What was his name that owned it? He married Jane Fonda. Oh yeah, I wrote. I was with the Washington Post editor that wrote the Playboy interview of Jane Fonda and her husband, who was a civil rights activist. And I was close to Jane Fonda at the time, and they were anti-war activists. So I burned my passport, and my children saw it. They were in college at the time, and I got to talk to them over the telephone around this time in 91 or 2, and they disowned me. They never wanted to see me again. They called me a traitor to the United States. And I certainly am a traitor to the United States imperialism. There's no doubt about that. But I'm not a traitor to the few good people that there are who don't want to be the empire that it is. Uh, Also in Cuba, I did a lot of volunteer work, which was to emulate, Che Guevara's volunteer work as when you want to build up to a stateless society, and which Fidel and Che wanted, and I wanted, and still would like to follow the Karl Marx's uh, idea of living in a non-capitalist world where we all share what we all produce. And therefore, we have no wars because wars are only fought for profit. Um, I led this course of life, and my children were, of course, indoctrinated by the opposite view. So we have never had contact since then, and they are now what, 55, I think. I'm 85, almost 85. Um, I did voluntary work on ships and plantations, um, cutting, sugar cane um, and drinking its results, both the juice and the spirit, the alcohol. And I sailed with 5 ships uh, uh, to see how sailors work, merchant marines. And I sailed to and fro Europe. And one time we had a near accident where many people would have been killed, and I was on the life raft and had many dramatic experiences in Cuba. And I love the Cuban people, and I think it's the best revolution that's been fought and won. And now, of course, there's so much, uh, you know, under, so much counter revolution that the United States constantly exports, that it is not as well developed as it used to be. And there are many young people who escape, they say, for freedom in the United States. They're doing, it's still basically a socialist country, but with a lot of capitalist uh, economy. And, the Yankees are doing the same thing or worse to Venezuela. And there may be another coup attempt there. Um, since 9/11, I've worked for a lot of alternative media, Axis of Logic, Dissident Voice, Counterpunch, Global Research, Counteraction, Covert Action Magazine, uh, and I've written 10 books. Uh, I think I think the most important book for today is the Russian Peace Threat, um, Pentagon on Alert. This is about basically Russia, but I start with Cuba uh, because the the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, of course, had the Cuban people had help from Russia, and Gagarin, Yuri Gagarin was the pilot, who broke the sound and was the first up there, and he when he was flying 2 days after he took his flight, the United States under Kennedy invaded Cuba, the Bay of Pigs. So this book starts there and goes up to 6 years ago when um, when the United States is in the Middle East and trying to take over Syria and other countries. So I've written about, I think, 12 books. 2 are self-published, and I was at with a friend from California. I wanted to talk about this. Roy Bourgeois, an unfortunate surname, but a Maryknoll priest. Theology of liberation. I'm an atheist, but my wife Yetta, or my lover, is a cultural Christian, and I think that the theory of liberation is very close to where I stand and where others do, of course, with wanting socialism and eventually a stateless society. Now, Roy Bourgeois invaded, so to speak, the School of the Americas, they called it in Georgia, where they have taken and still do soldiers and officers from Latin America and train them in all kinds of warfare, including torture, and that has been approved. Has been exposed by the School of America's Watch, as Roy Bourgeois' organization is called. And a friend of mine from California and I traveled there some years ago, and this is one of the men that Professor Felix Rolando Murillo Lopez, that the CIA murdered in Honduras, the 17th of September 2009. And we meet there from all over the world once a year. They used to be more often, but now it's once a year to protest and to commemorate the people that the United States has murdered. Well, in my latter years, I've written books, and I think among them that can be mentioned are Scandinavia on the Skids, The Failure of Social Democracy, the Tamil Nation in Sri Lanka. Oh, I want to say here that I went to India to write about the Tamil people, mainly in Sri Lanka, where the Hindu people have committed genocide. The government has committed genocide against the Tamil people there. And the one big complaint I have with Cuba's internationalism is that they did not support the Tamil people. This is very complicated to get into, but it has to do with geopolitics and, the associations, international associations. And almost nobody in the world, no country that I can recall, supported the Tamil people because they were a minority. And many countries have problems with minorities when they want their own country, like Spain, for example, with a couple of groups there. And of course, it would be better if we could all be united. But when we have capitalism, there is no unity. Sounds of Venezuela. Most of my books, I've been to these countries for several months, and I got to know, leaders. I got to know Hugo Chavez. I got to know Fidel a little bit. So I've written about many countries, uh, basically from what the people are doing. And now I'm quite old, um, and I might be coming. I might be coming to where you are. It looks like a possibility.
So let me ask you this: how did you and I ever meet?
Um, well, I write. I have a website, and I write about these wars. And uh, I was reading uh, a website when I saw your name, and you did a film, and some of your film, uh, I read about it. Excuse.
Or 30 seconds to midnight?
30 Seconds to Midnight. Well, I was very impressed with it, and I learned things that I did not know. Um, I knew, the overall story, but in some of these countries that you picked, and how evil the evil monster is. So I learned more about the evil, and I think I wrote you, how I was so pleased with your book, and then we talked online as we're doing now, and you told me about the Friends of Crimean. Now, Crimean is in my book, and maybe this will be something that I might close with. Maybe it's too early about that, but I have in my Russia book, Russia, the Peace Threat. Uh, I, I I I have several chapters of the Putin era and also before him, and why it was necessary for Crimean to come out of Ukraine and go back to where it was actually started. Russia has had that area for what, 2.5 centuries or 2 centuries or something. Whatever I can to help the Russian people, because the Russian people have wanted peace, and the United States does not want peace. I mean, it's an anathema to its genes. Its genetic nature is war. It is just a warmonger, and Russia does not want war, but it has a very difficult time living in a peaceful world when the juggernaut is always at its throat. The radical Pope Putin Forbes magazine uh, wrote, the US and European Union may want to save Crimeans from themselves, but the Crimeans are happy right where they are. 1 year after the annexation of the Ukrainian peninsula in the Black Sea, poll after poll shows that the locals there, be they Ukrainians or ethnic Russians or Tartars, are mostly all in agreement. Life with Russia is better than life with Ukraine. Um, this is something I have written in my book that I showed you, and I'm looking forward to coming if the CIA will allow me to get there, um, and see for myself um, what's going on. My life's activities, as I've stated earlier, have a lot to do with solidarity with people who are oppressed or discriminated against or exploited, and among them are people who want to live with Russia and not be an enemy of Russia. So therefore, I support and would and would like to see the Crimean people. I think the most fitting conclusion to my interview with you is that what the theology of liberationist and founder of the School of the Americas watch, what Roy Bourgeois, his name is, unfortunate after, but his credo is, it has always been about solidarity, to accompany, to make another struggles for justice and equality. And Roy Bourgeois still lives and still fights against U.S. torturing programs at the School of the Americas in Georgia. They have, they teach soldiers and officers how to torture people, and this is his main activity. So thank you for this interview.